Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to our SHS UCOM monthly virtual CME offering. If you do not know who I am yet, my name is Claire Collins. I am the Director of Academic Infrastructure and Professional Development here at SHS UCOM. And for purposes of what we do, I am over faculty training and things like that. So you see me a lot for faculty development and then also for things like CME. I'm really excited today to continue on with our Working with Adult Learners series. This is part 3 of 4. If you haven't seen our other 2 series, it's okay. You're not going to be behind. We're covering kind of a totally different topic today. And those former 2 faculty development sessions that are eligible for CME are available online through our SHS UCOM YouTube page. So just remember that that is always a resource for you. So to go ahead and kind of dive right in, I want to let you all know that I do not have any conflicts. No one is paying me to promote this type of educational material. I am not making any money off of it, nor do I have any influence, and no one has had any influence on the materials that are contained here within. Okay, so what are we going to be doing today, or what should you know by the end of what we're doing today? Well, let's jump right in with some session objectives. So at the end of this, I want you to be able to explain the importance of context when you're trying to complete a project with adult learners, employ strategies to communicate your shared goals and outcomes across your groups, and build trust and create buy-in within your own work. So the way that I've sort of designed this session is previously we've been talking about working with individual students, but in your roles at your clinical sites, you often work with a multitude of people. You'll work with residency directors, with residents in general, with CEOs, with CMOs. You know, there's a lot of people that you're working with, and you're just really kind of trying to get things done and get your projects done in a way that you're not wasting your time, right? Like, one of the things that we know about our clinical faculty, and that's you, is that you really, really value your time, and that time should not be wasted. And so this entire session is designed around this idea of, I work with a lot of different people. I have very specific goals that I am trying to achieve. And how do I motivate people and people who need to learn from me to finish those goals in a time frame that I set, and managing expectations? And what does that look like? And what are the things that I can influence? And what are the things that I can't? Okay, so to dive right in. Why am I doing this? Well, in my role, I work with people at all levels. I work with deans, I work with administrators, I work with staff, I work with faculty, I work with y'all. And I take in large amounts of information, synthesize that information, and then I push it back out to the various stakeholders. My job is to really kind of make sure that everyone is on the same page so that we're all moving in the same direction. And it's really easy to tell when I'm not on the same page with someone because things kind of go askew. So that's why I'm talking to you about this. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with some shared vocabulary before we get started. Formulating a common vocabulary is something that's really good to provide context. And I want to use the word year as an example. The word year is more nuanced than you would think. If you talk to like a lay person, right, a year is January to December. If you talk to someone in higher education, we're going to say, oh, is that a calendar year, an academic year? Is it a fiscal year? Is it just 365 days from now? Year means a lot of things, so we want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I'm going to use some words that are a little different than what we might normally see. And so I want to talk about that. I'm going to use the word planner. In this instance, that's you. You're the thing trying to get things done. You're planning on doing something. A program or a project, this can be an academic program or just a project you're trying to get done within your work. The planner is trying to get a program or a project done. And then your stakeholders. Your stakeholders are people with a vested interest in the program or project, and they could be actively working on the program or project with the planner or could be completely outside of it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then the organization. That's just simply, where do you work? Is it the department, the division, the university? At what scale is this program or project being completed? So we all know how to work a process, right? We're pretty familiar with how processes work. And in an ideal world, when we are trying to get something done, when we're trying to see if learning has occurred, if we're trying to get new ultrasound machines for the hospital, we like to think that the process is pretty straightforward and simple. Step 1, step 2, step 3, great, finished, final product, right? If you have ever worked on a committee, you know that no project, unless I control all aspects of it, is this simple. In fact, projects tend to be really way more complex. But even then, we tend to simplify them a little too much. And what we do is this: we say a big project, right? So you're working on a big task force and you're trying to get ready for a JCO site visit, right? So there's lots of people involved, and you think, oh, we're going to bring in group 1 and group 2, group 3, and they're going to collaborate, and then things are going to be great, and we're all moving the same direction. But what really happens? What really happens is this. Group 1 is powerful and big, and they're sucking up all the air in the funnel, and you're just trying to push down. And group 2 is kind of helping out, and the group 3 is just way over on the side, and they're just really, really struggling. And this is kind of like real life. This is the mess we all have to live with. And then it's super frustrating, right? Because you can't achieve your end goals. You can't get things done. And that has a habit of making us kind of feel like this. Every time I've ever worked on a committee, there comes a point where I feel a little like this in my work. And that's okay, because I have something for you. It's a planning tool. This is an actual planning tool. It's fully vetted. So I want to let you know that if you were to take a screenshot of like this piece of the presentation, this is really useful to you. So this is the interactive model of program planning, and it works for both educational pursuits or really just anything you're trying to get done. There are 4 major differences in this model than models that tend to be more linear, like the ones that we talked about before, step 1, step 2, and in process. Those are linear. This model has no beginning or end. It's understood that programs and projects can start from any point and then branch out, and planning is rarely a linear process, even if we would like it to be. This model takes into account that there are components and tasks going on at the same time, and it acknowledges that getting things done is a people activity, and that sometimes people are your biggest asset and also your largest liability. Planning is a negotiated activity for most projects and programs, and every stakeholder brings their own belief and context to the planning table. The name of planning is be flexible, and it's really just a practical tool. It doesn't sugarcoat things or ask you to live in an ideal world, and this model allows for the nuance of your work to be accounted for so that you can use it to guide your work and your stakeholders. So with all of that being said, selling you this program model, let's talk about what the model actually looks like. So in the middle, you have your project, right? This is the thing you're trying to get done. And then you have this next layer. And this layer is largely the things that you are trying to either establish or achieve. They're things that you have a lot of control over, a lot of influence over. And so you're going to see that evaluations are in there, right? So it's like how you're evaluating something, or what kind of support you have access to, or support you need to ask for. Like, you determine what those needs are, and that leads into your needs assessment or your goals and objectives. Sometimes your goals and objectives are very clear. Sometimes you start a project and the goals and objectives emerge over time, but you kind of control this. Then there's this next layer, and these are things that you control in collaboration with others. And so that's things like scheduling, right? You can't schedule a meeting if 10 people aren't able to come, that you're just sitting alone by yourself in a room somewhere. That's not productive. Or if you're working with a student, right? it doesn't do any good to talk about doing evaluations with the student if the student is already off of your clinical service. That doesn't make any sense either. But then also marketing, and I don't want you to think marketing is like formal marketing, like billboard ads. It's more like, how do you market this thing that you're doing or trying to get done? How do you create buy-in? Marketing is how you achieve that. And sometimes that's just like, if you really want something, you have to go like in the House, you whip the votes, right? You go and talk to key people who you need support from so this project can really get off the ground. That's marketing. But the thing I like about this model is these are the things that are within your control. These are the things that you and your committee or your group or just you as one person can have a lot of influence over. And then there's this extra layer out here: relationship building, cultural differences, technology, power and influence. And I want to note that none of these things are inherently bad, but they do tend to be the things where people break down, where things start not getting done. And especially with students, this tends to be the case. So let's talk about evaluations for a moment. If you're trying to give someone a really pretty negative piece of feedback, but it needs to be heard, it's easier to do that, right, if you have a strong relationship with someone. But if you barely know a student and you have to tell them immediately that like your whole approach is incorrect, that feels bad, right? And this acknowledges that. This acknowledges that like sometimes things feel bad and you've kind of got to push through it. Cultural differences is another one, right? That comes up all the time where you didn't know that something was a social norm in one culture that's not your primary culture. Very, very common. Or technology. How many times have you had a student show up to your clinic or your hospital and they're not in your EMR, your EHR, and so they're not able to help take notes, and that's a huge technology issue. And then power and influence. Sometimes we all have bosses, and so sometimes you have a boss who just says, "No, we're not going to do this thing. End of project," and this sort of acknowledges that. And so I want to talk about a couple of aspects of this model and why they're important, and why if you take these things into account when you're planning things, whether that be curriculum or how to approach your day-to-day work or how to approach large projects that you may be in charge of, or especially if you're interested in leadership development, if you take this tool and apply it well, then you'll see better outcomes across the board. And that's especially true when you're talking about adult learners. You're always trying to get things done. You're always trying to get things done as quickly as possible. And adult learners appreciate it when you have a framework like this to kind of lean on. And one of the things you'll see, right, is you don't need some big tool like a checklist to say you did all of these all the time, every single time. What you need to do is have an understanding of these base items to ensure that you're kind of hitting them over time. If you have one area that you're weaker in than another, that's okay, but you can point it out. Like, I know for sure that my weakest area is always needs assessment. I think I know what people need because I listen well, but I sometimes forget to send out a formal needs assessment. And so it's helpful in the CME process, right, that they identify that I have to do a gap analysis, and that one of the ways I can fulfill a gap is to send out a needs assessment and say, oh yeah, no, we really need this. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is context. So context. So these are structural factors. How do I get the work done? Who's going to help me do it? This is likely the most linear part of context because there's often transparency at this level. Structural factors are often spelled out in policy or process. And context has three issues that we're going to talk about. So like I said, structural factors, political factors, cultural factors. And these structural factors identify what you think the steps are to complete a project, identifies your context, and then also identify who owns a policy or process. That's one of the things I think we forget about a lot. is like, what's the scope of our work? What's the scope of our authority? What do we actually have the ability to ask people to do? And what are the things that people do just because they like us or they're afraid of us? Those are different things. I've often found within my work that I don't always understand why a policy or process exists. It's okay to just ask what the end goal of the process is if it helps give you the context you need to move forward. Sometimes asking general questions can lead to a process being altered slightly so that it's easier to navigate. And sometimes that's not always, and that's okay. And what I really mean by that is, have you ever seen a policy or process at your clinical site that you just thought, this doesn't work, or this doesn't make sense? Why does this exist? It's okay to question those policies and say, like, what are we trying to get out of this? So what does it mean, and how do I implement this well if it's a standard I'm being held to? Because sometimes what we find out, right, is that the policy is just outdated. You know, it hasn't been updated in 6 or 7 years. And now technology has advanced to the point where it's like, it's just not practical to have this policy anymore, or technology has made it so that we need to update the policy so that it's more complex, so that we're accounting for risks within technology. Then there's, in part of context, there's political factors. And this often affects who even has a seat at the planning table. If you're a planner, make sure you look at the stakeholders and you ask who's missing here. It's also important to ask who has an invisible seat at your table. As an example, a director with 30 staff members loudly lobbying for a change within their division means that this stakeholder is under a lot of pressure for the people that report to them. Similarly, there could be someone that works above a stakeholder with a seat at the table asking them to steer the planning group or committee. That's totally normal. That happens literally all the time. The real truth is that if you take the lead on a project, you should consider having some quiet meetings with each of your stakeholders so that you can answer the question, what's my motivation? And this counts for your students too, as stakeholders. What are you going to get out of this experience? And what are they hoping to get out of this experience? For instance, if you're a surgeon and a student says, well, I'd really like to see this really super common, rare surgery. Well, of course, you can't promise that. The surgical cases that come in are the surgical cases that come in. So aligning those expectations is just really, really, really important. And finally, cultural factors. These are things that we see and don't see about each other when we work together. And at the end of the day, we all need to remember that the people are still people, and we are all influenced by our own lived experiences, and bring that context to the table wherever we go. And a really common occurrence of this, right, is have you ever had a new person join your team and they just seem like they were scared all the time, and they're bringing baggage from a previous position, a previous job where they were mistreated? It takes them a while to unpack that, right? And about a year in, it's like they're a whole new person. And that's common, but that's a cultural factor. Cultural factor isn't just things related to like who we are in the outside world. It's all of these things that influence kind of our personality and the lens through which we see the world. And it's important to really just take that into account. Okay, so for structural factors, one of the things these are some just quick bullet points for you as a source of reference. So your structural factors are your mission, your goal, your objectives, your organizational hierarchy, quick, dirty. Your standard operating procedures, organizational decision-making, your political factors. So that's coalition building. You've probably heard that a lot. Bargaining, jockeying for a position, power and relations. This is where things get slowed down a lot in context, as people think that they're trying to achieve different goals, even though it's the same sort of project. I can even think of examples within like medical education, right? Where you want to talk about diabetes, and then you talk to a biochemist and they want to speak about one type of diabetes, and then you talk to a clinician, they want to talk about treatment plans and interventions. But if you talk to a nutritionist, they want to talk about something completely different. That type of politicking for like, what's the approach is very, very common. And then the cultural factors, remember that cultural factors are just incorporating people's history and traditions. It's the building blocks of our lives that kind of need to be taken into account. And that makes context. All of those things together make context. So when you're starting something new, when you are working with a student, there are some questions that I have adapted into my own work that have helped guide me a lot. And the way that it's helped guide me is I have found that when I am trying to motivate someone else and they don't want to be motivated, whether that's a student or a colleague or a group of people, that if they're not motivated, it demotivates me. And so having these sorts of questions, and I'm not going to read through all of them, really helps. And the first one is actually really important, is do I believe in the goal we're trying to reach? Well, sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, right? Like if I believe in the goal, it's always easier to get behind a project. But if I don't believe in the goal, the next question is, does that even matter? Because a lot of times I'm assigned to do things that are just job responsibilities that I just have to do. And so I like to kind of set the stage before I even start, which is just like, does it even matter if I care about this thing? Like what's the downside if I don't? And the real truth is if I've been asked to do something and I've been asked to do something by my supervisor, it doesn't matter if I believe in that goal. I am tasked with getting that thing done. And our medical students are kind of the same way, right? Where it's like, if you and your medical student have slightly different goals that you'd like to reach, it doesn't matter necessarily if they believe that they should be reaching your goal, because they need to be doing what you told them to do. And then the rest of them are about like things like, do I have the background to get this thing done? Am I working within inside the scope of what I'm allowed to do? Do I have the money to do what I need to do? And then it's also like, is any of this for the good of the order? That's the very last bullet point, and it's fairly important. When you're trying to get something done, if it's for a group of students or for a group of colleagues, one of the things that you always have to take into consideration is this a me or a we project? And that can apply to departments and it can apply to individuals. So if you have two departments at a hospital that are at odds with each other, right? And they're both trying to accomplish different means, and one starts jockeying and has a little more power and trying to get what they want, that's uncomfortable, right? Because it's not for the good of the order. For the good of the order, meaning like everyone's good, a universal good. And so it's easier to get projects done and get things done as a group, especially with adult learners, if there's understanding that this project is for the good of the order, especially if it's sort of a controversial project, right? And the thing that jumps to mind really for me is implementing a new EMR or EHR. What a massive undertaking and what a headache that is. And people will groan and grumble, but the real truth is if it needs to be done, it needs to be done. And it's for the good of the order, and hopefully it's not for the good of just a limited few. So we've talked a little bit about context, and I want to talk a little bit more about how do you get things done, like the way in which we get things done. And there's really just sort of 4 ways that people get work done. And that's aside from just like using your own skills. This is like working with people. So the first one is just consulting. You're reaching out to people, you're seeing what they think, how they feel about a topic. If you might have support if you push something forward. You know, if you're going to change your approach to how you teach in a clinical setting, it makes sense, right, that you talk to a medical student or a resident before you change that approach. You wouldn't just come in overnight and just say, well, I've thrown everything I know out the door and we're just going to try something new and you're my guinea pig. That makes people really uncomfortable, right? So don't do that. Always consult people. And then there's networking. And so that's what I talked about, like you're whipping the votes. And so if you decide you're going to make a big change, right? You want to make a suggestion back to the comp. A lot of times you're going to want more than one person to support this suggestion. And so that's your networking. And then bargaining. So you often have the ability to kind of change things in and out to say, especially in our program, right? It's like, well, we're not going to see these clinical presentations, but we'll see these other ones, and that should be good enough. That's bargaining, and that makes a lot of sense. And then there's pressuring, and pressuring is just really like kind of putting your thumb down on someone and saying like, we're going to do this thing because I said we're going to do this thing, and I have the power to enforce that. And that is the difference between influence and power. And so notice that these things overlap. So within my work, a lot of what I do is done through influence, right? So I work with a variety of people, but I don't have the power to say, you must do what I say at all times. I don't have that authority. Our dean has that authority. My boss has that authority over me. In theory, I have that power with the people who report directly to me as well. But does it feel good to do that? No. And specifically adults will push back really hard when there's pressure involved. Have you ever seen like a boiling pot, right, with a lid on it? And what happens when the pressure gets too high for no reason? The lid flies off, right? So not everything reacts well to pressure. But influence is something that people typically have a pretty good working relationship with. People like to be consulted. They like to be networked with. They're fine with bargaining. And so I want to advise you that if you're working with large groups of people, especially adults, if you're trying to get them to do something that maybe even they don't want to do, that you want to consult one of the top 3 things and not pressuring if you can help it. Now, there are times where it's absolutely appropriate to do pressurized things. So for instance, you are in a clinical setting with a student and you need them to behave in a very, very certain way. You need them to hand you an instrument of some kind. There is a protocol for that, and that protocol exists for patient and physician safety or medical personnel safety. And so it is fine to have pressure in that instance because you are actually in charge in that instance. It's like, you must do this. You must behave in this way. Hopefully you communicate it in a kind way, but it's totally fine to just say, this pressure is here to keep people safe, to keep people alive. That's always appropriate. So I don't want you to think that power has no place in the world. It certainly does. But if you're exerting power when you could just be exerting influence, people tend to take notice. Okay, so speaking of power, there's a great book called Laws of Power. It came out 20 something years ago. If you haven't ever read it, I highly recommend it. But here's where you are. The first one, win through your actions, never through argument. If you can avoid an argument, if you can bring people over to your side rather than needing to argue in a hallway or have a contentious meeting, try to do that. Don't build a fortress to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous. How many people do you know that are excellent at what they do, but if they needed help, no one would help them? That is very, very common, and it's common with clinicians. It's common with students. It's one of the things that you see a lot is that people start to isolate themselves, and a lot of times they isolate themselves because for a variety of reasons. But that isolation is dangerous because at some point you're going to need the help, and that's one of the things I would tell you is that if you need help, don't isolate yourself from us. In our very last CME session, we had kind of a who you going to call if you have issues or concerns or questions? And the answer was, call someone here. Don't isolate yourself. You're not there to solve every single problem that a student has. We're here to help you, so please do that. And then also preach the need for change, but never reform too much at once. And so in higher education, we have this concept of continuous quality improvement, right? Which is a part of assessment culture. And basically every year, one of the things that happens is we'll ask for your feedback, not just about the students, but like, how are we doing as a program? And we really, really, really respect what you all have to say. And one of the things that is helpful is if you suggest incremental changes, because if you overhaul everything all at once, it's like discombobulating to people. Like it really puts them under a lot of pressure and makes people feel very stressed. But really, one of the things that we talked about earlier, right, is that the name of getting things done, of like project planning, of working with adult learners is just go with the flow, be the water. This is an excellent note for people. I want to let you know that there are going to be many times when you have a student out on your rotation where things don't go the way you expected, and it won't be your fault. It won't be the student's fault. It's just something happened. Life happened. Politics at the hospital happened, a clinical site happened, the power went out in the middle of the day, like any number of things could happen. That is not your fault, and you don't have to tend to it right away. Just go with the flow, do your very best. That's all anyone is asking for. And as you are doing your very best, you need to communicate effectively. This cuts down on confusion so much. Remember I said we're going to establish a shared vocabulary? Do that. Don't let people be confused about common words that are in your practice. Don't. Like the number of times I have seen people miscommunicate about shared vocabulary items is astronomical. So if you have a unique word, or take a moment to pause and just formulate understanding. Like if someone says, I really need a scrub. Well, that could mean a couple of things. So that could mean I really need scrubs, like clothing items. Scrub could mean I need something cleaned. So it's okay if you don't understand to ask a question and just say, I'd like some clarification around what this means or what to do here. Establishing that shared vocabulary makes sure, right, that you're all moving the same direction, that you all have the same goals. And you need to set clear goals and benchmarks for every interaction. This is that piece that we talked about early on in adult learning, right? That adult learners work really well when goals and guidelines are really transparent for them. People can't achieve if they don't know what they're reaching for. And this is also an accountability measure for you. So it's like, how much should they be doing and for how long? And then set an action item. I love an action item. Having your stakeholders, your students volunteer or assign out smaller subtasks helps everyone you're working with feel included, and also identifies who owns a task and establishes additional accountability. And it's literally a box on your to-do list that you can strike through. And so this is what an action item might look like for you in a clinical setting. Is on your first day with a student in your rotation, you might look at them and say, okay, so it's you are going to be putting in all of the notes in my EMR or my EHR. Done. That's an action item. To-do list, check. And it means you don't have to do it. It means a medical assistant doesn't have to do it. A medical student can do that for you. They can help you. And, really what an action item helps do is it confirms your group understanding. It helps get everyone on the same page. It's okay to answer another question with another question. So my understanding of what you are asking is X, Y, and Z. And sometimes you'll be surprised just how out of sync everyone actually is. I am always surprised at the lack of understanding that I'm able to uncover if I ask a clarifying question. So ask lots of questions. Ask if students understand something. Ask where they stopped understanding something. They'll ask you tons of questions, and it's okay to ask them back. and then put it in writing. If you have the time, put something down on paper, in an email, in a text message. What it does is it's just re-emphasizing all of the points above. And not only does it solidify understanding, it is very practically a way to show progress is being made and sort of a CYA should you ever need it. Okay, so you've done all these things, you're working with your students, and you want to see about creating trust and buy-in. And this is a big deal, right? Because if people don't trust you or they're not bought into what you're doing, they don't learn as well from you. They don't have any interest in helping you achieve your own goals. And so this is sort of what that looks like. When you are establishing trust and buy-in, one of the big first pieces is you want to develop and maintain your credibility. You already have credibility because you're a physician out in the field. However, you want to basically try to do as good a job as possible when you're first working with students because they talk to each other, right? So just remember that as you're evaluating students, they are also evaluating you. And if you want to establish that trust and buy-in so the students know as soon as they hit the ground with you, they're going to be running or they're going to have long shifts, that maintaining this credibility is a big deal for them. And they like that. They like to know what they're kind of getting into. And then build on your success. So listen to the students you're working with, listen to your residency directors, listen to your residents, figure out what they're saying you're good at and just really, really just lean into it. Like there's no issue with that whatsoever. And then find a niche. Like I said, lean into the things that you're good at. Every single one of you chose a specialty, and some of you may have subspecialized or in like a subspecialty. It's the same concept, is find the thing that you're really good at teaching and lean into that. Maybe one of the things you're not good at is explaining a process, but what you are good at is clinical reasoning, like deconstructing the way that you think. That's perfectly fine. Every student is going to take away different things from you and value different things from different preceptors. So I don't want you to think that all precepting is uniform, because it certainly is not. Precepting is adaptable to each preceptor and their strengths. At the end, the students need to have achieved several learning outcomes, but how they achieve that learning is based on your skill sets, not their skill sets. And you should remember that this is built around you. So you're building trust in a group, right? So we're talking about groups today more than individuals. But this works great for individuals too. Two phrases that build trust. I don't know, but we can find out. Mistakes happen. Let's get back to work. So the second one I'm going to clarify. So just in case you're worried, I don't know, but we can find out. How many times have you been in a clinical setting and a patient has come in and you're pretty sure you know what's wrong with them, but you're not 100%, and you're going to go and consult a text or a colleague, notes you have. Heck, I've seen people consult YouTube videos about common skin ailments, things like that. It is not a problem for you to tell someone, I don't know, but we can find out. And what that does is, if you have someone that always knows the answer to everything, not only is that annoying, but also, don't you feel like you trust them a little less? And it's because there's no possible way they know everything, because they may know a lot of things about their specialty, but there's no way they know everything. There's too much to know. So if you've never heard someone say, I don't know, we start to inherently trust them a little less. Additionally, mistakes happen. Let's get back to work. Now, I do not mean big mistakes. Huge mistakes sometimes need a little more reflection, right? Something didn't go well with a patient, and we really need to sit with that because it was a big deal. But most mistakes are small mistakes, right? So it's like there's a small spelling error in notes. That's going to happen. There's no reason to beat someone over the head with the mistake. You just say, go in, fix the thing, let's get back to work. Like, don't let this small mistake, we all make hundreds of small errors every single day in what we do. We used the wrong word. We wore the wrong socks. We took someone's car keys with us to work. That actually happened to me the other day. But, really just kind of concentrating on, if it's something small, don't let it change your entire mindset for the day. And I want to really emphasize this when you're working with students, because the students, if they make a mistake in your presence, they're going to be really embarrassed. And you might find that they have a hard time putting themselves in what would be a vulnerable position again with you. And you don't want that. You want students to feel comfortable sharing that they're struggling with something, or that they made a mistake. Because what happens if you beat someone over the head every time they make an error and it's small? Eventually they stop telling you they made a mistake, and then you don't know, and those small mistakes become big mistakes. So try to have a balanced approach to how not all mistakes are mountains, but not all mistakes are molehills either. So try to have some context around that when you're working with people. A little grace goes a long way, I have found. Okay, so I am going to give you an action item for you to take away from this presentation, because I love an action item. I want you to start thinking about a project or program you're working on. Remember, you're getting ready to take students right now, and so this is going to help you personally prepare for that. Who are the stakeholders? Who has the influence? Who has power? Are there any cultural factors that need to be taken into consideration? For instance, I can tell you that one thing you might start thinking about is you're going to be seeing a lot of millennials and Gen Zs out in the field, right? And we all know that people tend to have very strong opinions about the work ethic or the approach to work of millennials and Gen Zers. So start thinking about what that's going to mean to you in your clinical setting, and if there are any kind of guidelines that you need to put in place before students ever get there. You want to establish a common vocabulary for your program or project. Identify your potential future action items and who's going to handle them. So for instance, if your site has an orientation, who's handling that orientation? When are you going to see students on their first day? Do they report directly to orientation? Are they coming directly to you? Do you know that? How is that being set up? I can tell you now that we're in contact with your clinical sites to help set up things like orientation. But as far as the schedule after orientation, that's up to you. And so having those things kind of lined out will help you ease into this a lot more. And then start building your trust with your stakeholders by communicating your key goals and objectives. And so put it in writing. Put what you need from us in writing. We do the same to you all, right? These are our expectations. This is what we need you all to do. And it's fair for you to send something back to us and say, and then these are the things I need from you for support so we can all achieve these goals. So I want to recap a little bit. So we talked about this approach to getting things done, this project model, working with people and understanding that people are pretty nuanced. And this is kind of really why it works. So it sets clear expectations. It helps you identify who your stakeholders are, moves your program and projects forward, and honestly, it's pretty non-confrontational in approach. That's one of the big things I feel like people are always sort of looking for when they're trying to get their work done or trying to work with new people where conflict may arise, is they're always looking for ways to kind of avoid conflict if they can, where it's appropriate. And so I want to kind of leave you with this. If you take away nothing else from this today, I want you to have this model. And the model is not meant to be it's not a checklist. It's not, did you do these things? It's meant to just help guide you in your work, in working with other people. And it's meant to help be a guide for working with the widest variety of people possible. We have 73 students we're going to send out in clinical rotations, and they come from all kinds of different backgrounds with a variety of skills already present, and a variety of different levels of preparation. We have some who are just absolutely brilliant, and we have some that are going to need just a little bit of coaching. And so this model kind of takes into account how you deal with each kind of person that you're going to be dealing with. So for support, someone who is a rock star, right, may need less support, and you're not needing to support them as much. Someone who's struggling a little more, you might need to take an extra 30 seconds to explain something to them really in depth, so that real learning happens in the field, understanding how you got to a certain diagnosis, or why you prescribed a certain thing, or what the drug interaction is that you know that they don't know. But at the same point in time, they're going to have the same thing, right? Where they have their own internal goals and objectives, and they want to meet those. And you have your own goals and objectives that want to be met. And this model kind of accounts for that. And so if you take some time to sort of reflect on this, one of the things that you're going to see is that things that seemed really, really complex start getting boiled down to sort of their base entity. And it's a really great way to kind of shift your mindset, so that work gets done in meaningful ways and also doesn't slow you down long term. I can tell you that I actually do use this model in basically everything I do, even putting together this presentation, and it saves me a ton of time, because now I have sort of a standard operating procedure in my head of how I want to get things done, what objectives I want to meet, how I'm going to do it, and what my rate limiting step is. Okay, so that is it for today. Are there any questions? Okay, so I am not seeing any questions so far. Let me pull up our link so that you all can take your survey and you can claim your credit when you're ready. Let me put this in the chat. As a reminder, we do record all of these. And so in just a couple of days, we will put this out on the SHSUcom YouTube site, and you can go and view it at your leisure. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and put the claim credit information. Remember, our partner is Incedo for the CME activities. And so if you are looking for your access code to claim your credit, I will put that in the chat. There you go. Okay, so I will see you all next month, and we will be having another CME. See you then.